James worked quietly in the big glass building, moving his mop from one shiny tile to the next. He was the night janitor, and most people barely noticed him. He came in when the office was almost empty, cleaned every corner, emptied every bin, and left without a word. Some nights he would pause for a moment to look at the grand piano in the corner of the lobby. It was a beautiful black piano, polished so much it shone under the lights, but he never touched it. It wasn't his place. One Friday night, a group of young office workers stayed late. They were celebrating after finishing a big project, and their laughter echoed in the quiet building. They spotted James mopping near the entrance. One of them, a tall man with a smirk, nudged his friend and whispered something. The friend laughed, and soon they all looked at James. "Hey," the tall man called, "why don't you play us something on the piano?" His tone was playful, but not in a kind way. It was the kind of voice that expected the other person to fail. They thought it would be funny to see the quiet janitor try and embarrass himself. James paused, his hands tightening around the mop handle. He glanced at the piano, then back at the group. A few others in the lobby turned to see what was happening. Some smiled, waiting for the joke to play out. "I don't know if that's a good idea," James said softly. "Oh, come on," another voice urged. "It's just for fun," the tall man added. "Don't be shy. We're all friends here." Though his grin said otherwise, something in James's eyes changed. He set the mop aside and slowly walked toward the piano. The group chuckled quietly, expecting a clumsy mess of random notes. He pulled out the bench and sat down, his back straight, his fingers hovering just above the keys. For a moment, there was silence. Then his fingers pressed the first chord. The sound that filled the lobby was not what anyone expected. It was rich, warm, and full of feeling. The first few notes seemed to reach into the air and wrap around everyone in the room. Conversation stopped. The laughter faded. And even the security guard near the door turned his head. James's hands moved with a quiet confidence. His eyes closed, and his body swayed gently with the rhythm. It was as if the piano was speaking. And James was the voice. The group that had called him over now stood frozen, their smirks gone, replaced by wide eyes. The melody rose and fell, carrying a story without words. It was a story of hope and loss, of joy and deep sadness. Somehow, even without knowing the song, everyone could feel what it meant. It was like hearing someone's life in music. A young woman in the group felt a lump in her throat. She had only asked him to play because she thought it would be funny. Now she couldn't stop listening. A man walking past the building outside slowed down and pressed his face to the glass to hear better. In the corner, the elevator doors opened. The CEO stepped out, holding a folder of late-night reports. He was about to head to his car when the sound stopped him in his tracks. He followed the music to the lobby, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. When he saw James at the piano, the sight made him pause. He had seen the janitor before, always quiet, always working. But he had never seen this, the way James's hands moved as if they belonged to the piano itself. The CEO felt something stir inside him, an old memory of his wife playing music on quiet Sunday mornings. He stood at the back, saying nothing, not wanting to break the spell. The song continued, growing softer, almost like a whisper. It felt personal, like a secret being shared. No one in the room moved, even the air seemed still, holding on to every note. James's fingers slowed, touching the keys as if they were fragile. Finally, the last note lingered in the air. Fading into silence, no one clapped at first. It wasn't because they didn't want to. It was because they couldn't. The moment felt too full, too heavy to break. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. The sound echoed in the lobby, joined by others, until the room was full of applause. The young workers who had expected a joke now looked at James with something close to shame. James stood slowly, giving a small nod. He picked up his mop again, as if nothing had happened. But the CEO's voice cut through the applause. "James," he called, his voice softer than usual. "Where did you learn to play like that?" James looked up, his expression unreadable. He hesitated before answering. "My mother taught me." Then he turned back to his work. Leaving the question and the room hanging in silence, the sound of James's music still hung in the air long after his fingers had left the keys. It was like the melody had settled into the walls, refusing to fade. People were still standing where they had been. Caught in the moment, the young workers who had called him over now shifted uncomfortably. They didn't know what to say. It was supposed to be a joke, a quick laugh before going back to their drinks. But now it felt like they had opened a door to something much deeper. James didn't rush away from the piano. He sat for a moment, hands resting in his lap. His eyes were far away, like he was still hearing the song in his mind, when he finally stood. There was a weight in the room, a heavy, quiet respect. But before he could leave, a voice spoke from the back. "Play another," the CEO said. Stepping forward into the light. The words were not a command, but a request, soft and sincere. James turned to look at him, his brow furrowed slightly. "Sir, I should get back to work," he said quietly. But the CEO shook his head. "Please." There was something in the man's tone that made James pause. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was need. The CEO's eyes held a glimmer of something almost fragile. It was the look of someone who had just been reminded of a memory they didn't want to lose. James hesitated only a moment more before. Sitting down again, his fingers touched the keys like he was greeting an old friend. The first notes came out slow, gentle, like footsteps on soft earth. The melody was different from before. This one had light in it. It rose and fell like laughter, yet still carried a thread of sadness. People leaned in without realizing it. The young woman from earlier felt her eyes sting. She didn't even know why. She just knew the music made her remember her grandmother's smile. In the corner, the security guard stopped pretending to check his phone. A few more people passing outside paused to look in through the glass. The world outside felt far away. All that mattered was here. The song began to grow in strength. The notes climbing higher and higher. James's hands moved faster now, yet every touch was precise. The music wrapped around the listeners like warm sunlight after a storm. The CEO closed his eyes, letting the sound pull him somewhere else. He could almost hear his late wife's voice humming along. The memory hit him so suddenly that he had to take a deep breath. By the time James reached the middle of the song, the lobby had changed. It wasn't just a place for business anymore. It felt like a stage. But not the kind of stage with bright lights and an audience waiting to be entertained. This was a stage where every note was a confession, every chord a truth. James leaned into the final stretch, his body swaying gently, his face calm but focused. It was clear this wasn't about showing off. It was about speaking in the only language he truly trusted. Music, the last part of the melody, slowed, each note lingering in the air. The sound softened, almost like a whisper. It felt as if James was saying goodbye to someone only he could see when the final chord came. It was so soft that the silence afterward felt almost loud. No one moved for several seconds. Then, quietly, the CEO clapped, just once. But the sound echoed in the stillness. The others followed, some slower than others, until the room filled with applause again. But this time, the clapping didn't feel like a performance had ended. It felt like gratitude. James stood again. Giving the smallest of nods, the CEO stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "That song. Who taught you that one?" he asked. James's eyes softened. "No one, sir," he said. "I made it up over the years." The CEO nodded slowly, as if that explained everything and nothing at the same time. He glanced at the young workers who had started this whole thing. Their heads were slightly lowered, not in shame alone, but in respect, you know? The CEO said, turning back to James. There are people who spend their lives chasing talent like yours. James gave a small smile. It's not about chasing, sir, he replied. It's about feeling. With that, he gently closed the piano lid. The sound of it clicking shut seemed to mark the end of something important. The group didn't try to joke anymore. Instead, they watched in silence as James returned to his mop. But the music stayed in their heads, refusing to fade. Later that night, when most of them had gone home, the CEO lingered in the lobby. He stood near the piano, his hand resting on its smooth surface. It was strange, he thought. A simple request meant to mock had turned into something unforgettable. He made a silent promise to himself. This would not be the last time James played for this building. The building was almost empty when the CEO asked James to follow him upstairs. The young workers who had started the whole thing stood to the side, unsure if they should leave or stay. James hesitated, his hand still on the mop handle. "I still have cleaning to do, sir," he said quietly. The CEO shook his head. "This won't take long." They rode the elevator in silence. James stood straight, looking at the polished doors while the soft hum of the machine filled the air. The CEO kept glancing at him, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. When they reached the top floor, the doors opened to the large executive suite. It was a room of glass walls, leather chairs, and soft carpets. The city lights stretched out beyond the windows. Glowing against the night sky, the CEO walked to a corner of the room where a smaller, older piano stood. It was covered in dust, the wood slightly faded. James's eyes flickered toward it. "My wife used to play here," the CEO said softly, almost to himself. "She passed away 5 years ago." James's fingers tightened slightly at his sides. "I'm sorry, sir," he replied quietly. The CEO motioned toward the piano. "That song you played downstairs, the first one, sounded like something she used to love." James gave a small nod. "It's called Moonlight Roads. My mother taught it to me when I was a boy." The CEO swallowed hard, turning away toward the window. "She used to hum something like that when she cooked breakfast," he said, his voice catching just slightly. James stepped closer to the piano. "Would you like me to play it again, sir?" he asked. The CEO didn't turn around, but his shoulders lowered, and he said, "Please." James sat down and gently lifted the lid. The keys were a little stiff from years of not being played, but he knew how to coax them back to life. The first notes rose softly, filling the quiet office like warm air on a cold night. The CEO stood with his hands in his pockets. Looking out at the city, he tried to keep his composure, but the music pulled at something deep inside him. Each note seemed to lift a memory from where it had been buried. He could see his wife's face as clear as if she were in the room, smiling at him across the breakfast table, her voice laughing in the garden, her fingers brushing the hair from his forehead. The sound grew fuller, richer, and the CEO's eyes blurred. James didn't need to look to know what the music was doing. He had seen this before. Music had a way of breaking through the walls people built around themselves. By the time he reached the heart of the song, the CEO had turned from the window. His cheeks were wet, but he didn't wipe them. He walked to his desk and sat down heavily, letting the music wash over him when the last note faded. There was no applause, no words at all for a moment. The CEO leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He took off his glasses and set them aside. "Do you know," he said slowly, "I have been in this office for years, thinking that nothing could move me again." He looked at James, his voice quieter. "You proved me wrong tonight." James lowered his gaze. "I just play what I feel, sir," he said. "That's all I've ever done." The CEO let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's not all you've done, James. You reminded me I'm still human." They sat in silence for a while. The CEO reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a framed photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes. He placed it on the piano. James looked at the picture and nodded, as if the music and the memory belonged to each other. "She would have loved to hear you play," the CEO said, almost in a whisper. Finally, the CEO stood, straightening his jacket. "I want you to perform at the company gala next month," he said firmly. James shook his head almost instantly. "Sir, I'm not a performer. I'm just a janitor." The CEO stepped closer, his voice steady. "No. James, you're the soul this place didn't know it had." James opened his mouth to protest again, but the CEO raised a hand. "This is not a request, it's an invitation." James's eyes lingered on the piano before he gave a slow, reluctant nod. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. "That's all I ask," the CEO replied. As James left the executive suite and stepped back into the elevator, he felt strange. He had played for strangers before in churches, in community centers. But this was different. Something had shifted tonight. The music had reached someone he never thought would hear him, and for the first time in a long while. James felt like maybe the world still had room for his music. The next evening, James arrived for work as usual. His uniform was the same, his mop and bucket ready, and his footsteps steady, but inside, his mind was still on the conversation from the night before. The CEO's words echoed in his head. "You're the soul this place didn't know it had." He didn't quite understand why it bothered him. Not because it was unkind, but because it touched a part of him he had kept locked away for years. That night, as the building grew quiet, James found himself near the piano in the lobby again. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the polished keys. It had been so many years since music had been a regular part of his life, for most of that time, his talent had been hidden, buried under the weight of survival. He reached out and touched the keys lightly, but didn't press them. He knew that if he started playing, the memories would come. And not all of them were good, years ago, before the uniform and the mop. James had been a young man with a dream. He had grown up in a small neighborhood where money was scarce, but music was everywhere. His mother worked long hours at a diner, but every evening she would sit at their old upright piano. She taught him his first song when he was only 6. She would smile and say, "James, music is a language the heart understands without words." By the time he was 12, he could play better than anyone in the neighborhood. People would gather outside their house just to hear him. They would say, "That boy's going to be something one day." But life had its own plans. When James was 17, his mother fell ill. Her hands, once quick and graceful on the keys, grew too weak to play. James worked part-time jobs to help pay for her medicine. He still played, but only late at night when the house was quiet. After she passed away, the music didn't sound the same. It felt empty. Like a conversation with no one on the other side. In his early 20s, James was offered a chance to audition for a music conservatory. It could have changed his life, but on the morning of the audition, his younger brother was arrested after getting into trouble. James spent the day at the police station instead. By the time he got home, the opportunity was gone. He never got another one. Bills piled up, and James took whatever work he could find. At first it was construction, then warehouse shifts. Eventually, he found a steady job as a janitor. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid on time, and most importantly, it was quiet. In the silence of empty buildings, he could hear music in his head, even if he didn't play it. Now, standing in the lobby years later, James thought about how easily people saw only the surface. To most of them, he was just the man who cleaned the floors. No one asked what he had been before. No one wondered if there was more to his story. And James had learned to accept that. It was easier to keep the past in the shadows, away from the world. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. It was the CEO again, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to James without asking. "I was hoping I'd find you here," the CEO said. "I wanted to talk more about last night." James took the cup, still unsure why this man cared so much. "There's not much to tell, sir," he said quietly. The CEO shook his head. "I don't believe that. People don't play the way you do unless there's a story." James hesitated, then sighed. "My mother taught me everything." "And life took the rest away," he said simply. It was the first time in years he had spoken about her to anyone outside his family. The CEO didn't interrupt. James found himself talking more than he intended about the neighborhood he grew up in, about the old piano in their living room, about the day his mother's hands could no longer play, about the audition that slipped away, about the way music had been his dream until survival became more important. By the time he finished, the coffee in his cup was cold. The CEO sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "You've lived a life most people in this building couldn't imagine," he said. "But you're wrong about one thing. Life didn't take music from you. It's still there, waiting for you to let it breathe." James looked away. Uncomfortable with the weight of those words. "Maybe," he said softly. The CEO smiled faintly. "The gala's in 3 weeks. James, you have time to decide." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving James alone with the piano. For a long time, James just stood there, staring at the keys. His fingers itched to play. And for the first time in years, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was time to bring his music out of the shadows. The next few days passed like any other for James. He swept the floors, polished the windows, and emptied trash bins. But the thought of the CEO's invitation to the gala stayed in the back of his mind. It wasn't the kind of thing a janitor expected to hear. He had never played for a big crowd, not in a long time anyway, and certainly not for people in expensive suits with champagne glasses in their hands. One evening, as James was cleaning the lobby, the CEO came down from his office. He had that same calm but determined look on his face. "Well?" he asked simply. James paused, leaning on his mop. "Well, what, sir?" "You've had time to think about it," the CEO said. "Are you going to play at the gala?" James shook his head slowly. "I don't know, sir. I'm not sure I belong there." The CEO stepped closer. "James, that night in the lobby, you changed the whole atmosphere of this building. Do you understand that? You made people feel something real." James gave a small smile. "Maybe. But feelings don't mean I can stand up in front of hundreds of people without freezing." The CEO didn't back down. "You have 3 weeks," he said firmly. "I'll make sure the piano is ready every night after hours. Practice if you want to. And decide when you're ready," without waiting for a reply. He walked toward the exit, leaving James standing there in the soft glow of the lobby lights. That night, after the building emptied, James sat at the piano. He placed his fingers on the keys, but didn't play right away. Instead, he took a deep breath and let the silence settle. Then, slowly, he began to play a simple tune, one he hadn't touched since his mother was alive. The sound filled the empty space, echoing softly against the marble floors. It was rough at first, his fingers stiff from years of neglect. But as he played, the stiffness faded and the old muscle memory returned. Night after night, James practiced. He didn't tell anyone, not even the security guard who often walked by and smiled at him. Sometimes he worked on pieces his mother had taught him. Other times he made up his own, letting his feelings guide the music each time he played. He imagined what it would feel like to perform in front of a crowd, and each time, the fear in his chest felt a little smaller. One evening, a young receptionist named Clara stayed late to finish some reports. As she walked past the lobby, she heard James playing. She stopped, hidden just behind the corner, and listened. The music was slow and warm, like a conversation between two old friends. When the last note faded, she stepped into view. "That was beautiful," she said softly. James looked up, startled. "Oh, I didn't know anyone was still here," he replied, a little embarrassed. Clara smiled. "You should play at the gala, you know." James shook his head. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," she said. "People need to hear this, James. It's not just music. It's a story." Her words stayed with him long after she left. As the gala drew closer, the CEO checked in more often. "How's the practice?" he would ask. "Coming along," James would reply, still unsure if he would actually go through with it. But the truth was, something inside him had started to shift. The music was waking up a part of him he thought had died long ago, and with it came a small but growing desire to share it again. 1 week before the gala, the CEO handed James an envelope. Inside was a neatly pressed suit, dark blue with a crisp white shirt. "I can't play in this," James said with a chuckle. "Yes, you can," the CEO replied, "and you will." James looked at the suit, his fingers brushing over the fabric. It had been years since he had worn anything like it. It made him feel different, like maybe he did belong after all. That night, James stayed at the piano longer than usual. He imagined the ballroom filled with people, the lights low, and the sound of glasses clinking in the background. He imagined sitting down, feeling every eye on him, and then letting the music speak for him. For the first time, instead of fear, he felt excitement, a quiet kind of excitement that made him smile as he played. By the time he finished, the security guard was leaning on the doorframe, listening. "You gonna play for the big shots next week?" the guard asked with a grin. James gave a small nod. "Yeah, I think I am." The invitation had started as a terrifying idea. But now it was becoming something else. A chance not just to play music, but to be seen for who he really was. For years, James had been invisible in the same building where he worked every night. In 1 week, that was going to change. The night of the gala arrived faster than James expected. For 3 weeks, he had practiced in the quiet lobby after hours. But now the silence was replaced with the hum of voices. The ballroom was alive with soft golden lights, the clinking of glasses, and the sound of expensive shoes on polished floors. James stood just beyond the side curtain, his dark blue suit fitting better than he thought it would. He adjusted the cuffs nervously, his palms already warm from where he stood. He could see the grand piano in the center of the stage, its surface shining under the spotlight. The CEO walked over to him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Remember," he said quietly, "just play the way you did in the lobby." James nodded. Though his stomach was tight, the announcer stepped onto the stage, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Tonight, we have a special guest," he said. With a smile, someone whose music touched this company in a way we will never forget. He looked toward the side curtain. "Please welcome James." James stepped out into the light. The room seemed bigger than he imagined. Hundreds of faces turned toward him. Executives, investors, staff, and even some people he didn't recognize. He could feel the weight of every gaze. Some in the crowd looked surprised, whispering to each other as they realized the special guest was the janitor. James walked to the piano and sat down. His hands hovered over the keys for a moment as he took a deep breath. The chatter in the room softened to silence, and then he began. The first notes were gentle, almost like a whisper. They floated through the air, warm and slow. The melody grew, each chord pulling the listeners deeper into the sound. James forgot about the crowd, forgot about the lights. It was just him and the music. The way it had always been. His fingers moved with purpose, every note a piece of his story in the front row. Clara sat with her hands folded, a small smile on her face. The security guard leaned against the back wall. Listening with pride, the CEO sat still, his eyes closed, letting the music take him somewhere else entirely. Halfway through, the song shifted. The gentle beginning gave way to a richer, fuller sound. It was a conversation between joy and sadness. Some notes were bright and hopeful. Others carried a weight that made the room feel still. People in the audience began to feel it. The way the music wasn't just pretty, it was true. James's mind wandered to his mother. He saw her hands on the old upright piano in their living room. He remembered her voice telling him that music could speak for the soul. And tonight, he was speaking not just for himself, but for her. The melody rose higher, filling the space like sunlight breaking through clouds. By the time he reached the final stretch, some people in the audience were quietly wiping their eyes. Even the toughest-looking executives had softened, their expressions open in a way that didn't fit the usual corporate mask. The last notes slowed, growing softer until they faded completely. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the room erupted in applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It was loud, full, and long. Some stood to their feet, the sound echoing. Against the high ceiling, James stood slowly, giving a small nod. He didn't bow deeply. It wasn't his style, but the gratitude in his eyes was clear. The CEO walked onto the stage and shook his hand firmly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "this is James. He's been part of this building for years, and tonight he reminded us all that talent, heart, and soul can be found in the most unexpected places." The crowd applauded again, louder than before. James felt his chest tighten, not from fear now, but from something like relief. For years, he had been invisible in this place. Tonight, they saw him. After he stepped off stage, Clara was the first to reach him. "That was incredible," she said, her voice full of emotion. The security guard clapped him on the back. Grinning, the CEO joined them, leaning in close. "So," only James could hear, "you've changed this company, James, and you've changed me." James didn't know what to say, so he just smiled as the night went on. People kept coming to speak with him. Some asked about his music, others just wanted to thank him for what they had heard. It was overwhelming, but in the best way, later. When the crowd began to thin and the music from the speakers replaced the sound of his piano, James found a quiet corner. He sat with a glass of water in his hand, looking out over the room. The fear that had once stopped him from saying yes to this night felt far away now. In its place was something stronger, the knowledge that music had given him his voice back. The gala had ended hours ago, but the sound of the applause was still ringing in James's mind. He stood in the empty ballroom now, the tables cleared, the lights dimmed, and the piano sitting silently in the center. It felt strange hours. Earlier, this room had been alive with voices and music. Now, it was quiet again. The way James usually knew buildings to be, the CEO stepped in from the hallway, his jacket slung over his shoulder. "You're still here," he said with a faint smile. James nodded, just needed a minute. The CEO walked over to the piano and rested his hand on the lid. "You know, I've been coming to events like this for 20 years, he said. "And I can't remember the last time I saw people this moved." James didn't know how to answer, so he just shrugged lightly. "I just played," he said. The CEO shook his head. "No, James, you didn't just play. You told them something they didn't even know they needed to hear." There was a pause before the CEO reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I want you to take this," he said, handing it over. Inside was a formal letter, an offer for a new position in the company as Director of Cultural Ultras and Community Events. It came with a salary that made James's eyes widen, and a note about organizing music nights, charity concerts, and outreach programs. James looked up, confused. I don't know if I'm the right person for this," he said slowly. "You're exactly the right person," the CEO replied firmly. "You understand what makes people feel connected? That's more valuable than anything else we do here, James." Hesitated, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. For so long, he had been the man no one noticed, the one in the background, and now, here he was being offered a place in the front. He thought of his mother, her voice telling him that music was a language the heart understood. Maybe, he thought, she had been right all along. The next week, word about the gala began to spread. Someone had filmed part of his performance and posted it online. Within days, it had been shared thousands of times. Messages started arriving at the company, strangers thanking James for the music, saying it reminded them of loved ones. Some even wrote that it had given them hope in hard times. James began his new role quietly. He still helped the janitorial staff sometimes, not because he had to, but because he didn't want to forget where he came from. But most days, he worked with the events team, planning music programs for the company and the community. He invited local school choirs, small jazz groups, and even solo performers who had never played for a large audience before. He wanted others to feel the same chance he had been given. One afternoon, Clara stopped by his new office, a small room with a window overlooking the city. On his desk sat a framed photo of his mother next to a small plant. "I still can't believe you're not in the lobby mopping floors anymore," she said. With a grin, James smiled. "Oh, I still go down there now and then. The piano needs a friend." Months passed, and the company's image began to change. It wasn't just about numbers and business deals anymore. There was a sense of connection among the employees that hadn't been there before. And it all seemed to trace back to one night, one song, and one man who had once been overlooked. One evening, as the building was closing, James sat alone at the lobby piano. The lights were dim, the streets outside quiet. He began to play Moonlight Roads again, the song his mother had taught him. The sound filled the space, warm and familiar. He thought of the journey from the shadows to this moment, of the people who now knew his name, and of the life ahead that he had never imagined was possible. When he finished, he didn't hear applause. There was no audience this time. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that music had carried him to a place where he could finally be himself. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys and smiled. For years, he had been just a janitor, but now he was more, not because of a job title or a bigger paycheck, but because he had finally been seen for who he really was, and that, he thought, was worth more than anything.